We are being recorded now, so should we wait one more minute?
We can pause the recording.
All right, thank you. Okay, you can start the recording again. I'm going to open council time for Wednesday, April the 14th. We will first approve the minutes of the last meeting.
Yeah, Chair, I'll move for approval, but I want to make a note. The minutes that we were emailed are for this meeting, but the minutes that are online are actually minutes from a meeting of the Charter Review Commission. So I am moving to approve our council time minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for checking that online. Can I have a second, please?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes of the last meeting. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
And this would be the minutes for council time meeting, not the other. Okay, moving on to old business, vacant buildable lands model. Do we have somebody who is going to say a few words here, Kathleen?
Yes, good morning, Madam Chair and council members. This is Oliver, Community Planning Director. With your permission, I would just like to say make a few comments or provide some background and then turn it over to Jose Alvarez, who will be going over some of the, or one of the memos that we provided to council. Councillors, I just want to go back to the fact that there were, in the beginning, 6 counties mandated by law to do the buildable lands report. Those 6 urban counties are Pierce County, Snohomish County, King County, Skagit, Tustin, and Clark. Those were the first 6 counties mandated to do the buildable lands report. Whatcom County was added by the legislature in 2017. So what does that mean? It means that Clark County has been fulfilling the ongoing reporting requirements stipulated by RCW 3678-215. In a form of a background, Clark County did the first plan monitoring report. It wasn't required by state. That first plan monitoring report was from 1995 to 1999. That was published July of 2000. The second plan monitoring report that was prepared was in 2000 to 2004. That was published in June of 2005. And that was before Section 215 came into play. The county had some benchmark in our comprehensive plan identifying issues that should be monitored. When the legislature added Section 215 to the Growth Management Act, that's when Clark County and the other counties that I mentioned were mandated to do the buildable lands report. Since 2000, the first report went to the state from 1995 to 2000. That was published August of 2002. The second report, 2000 to 2006, was published in August of 2007. Then 2006 to 2014, that was published in 2015. That report, the June 2015, was completed before the plan update occurred in 2016. Now, what I would like to say to the council, and I think the council is aware of this, the buildable lands report or model is just a tool that we use in looking back and saying, how has the urban growth area developed? And do we have enough land within the urban growth boundary to accommodate the growth that the county has already planned for? That's what the model is all about. It does not usurp the council ability to make policy. For example, the model is not about what the growth of the county should be. That is a policy decision that the council will have to make. We have had some issues that is still being discussed today about whether the model should apply to the rural area or not. I don't want to go back to the 2016 planning effort, but I think some of the councillors will recall that we had this discussion. It wasn't so much about disagreement, it was more of a clarification. And I recall that the county at the time hired a consultant out of Mesa Island, Robert Top, an associate, who did a very similar analysis and concluded that we could not apply the urban model to the rural area. The same conversation we're having today, that it's not proper to do so. Now, since the section 215 was written, there haven't been any amendment to that until recently through the legislative action by adoption of or implementation of section the legislation 5254, which calls for, again, the counties to show their work and report on achieved densities and other requirements, which led to the Commerce publishing the guidelines that we are using. And as a result, we hired a consultant. We could have done the work internally, but the state provided us some funding or grant to do the work. And we are not alone in terms of the counties that hired a consultant to help them address the guidelines and making sure that we can show our work in the next report that we submitted to the state. That's why we hired a consultant, an independent body, to look at some areas and how to help us make sure that our model is as accurate as it can be, even though there are a couple of things that are being missed. So following the work session that we had with council on March 3rd, councillors asked us to provide additional information and answer some questions. One of the questions was, which issues were considered and why? What are the dissenting views? And how do achieved densities compare with targets? Staff responded to those questions, plus additional documentation that we provided to council, pretty much staying with the process and what the project advisory group did. So we had the memo dated March 24th. That's where we addressed the issues raised by council. We also had one-on-one with councillors. In our discussion, there were two letters that councillors received, one from the city of Vancouver and the other from a group of folks from the building industry, those that also served on the project advisory group. And council asked us to provide some clarity based on the issues that they raised. And we did so, again, relying on the process that the group went through. So that response was provided on the memo dated April 1. And I am very hopeful that we have addressed the issues or try to provide some clarity. So with the council, I would like Jose to, if you don't want us to go back to the March 24th memo, he can start with the April 1, but I'll turn it over to Jose unless you have questions for me. At the end of the day, what I'm going to ask council is, are you at a point that you're ready to go to a hearing and consider the recommendation of the project advisory group? That would be my question or ask at the end of this conversation or discussion, Councillor. So with that, if you don't have questions for me, I will be available to answer any questions that you may have. But with that, I will turn it over to Jose.
Thank you, Oliver. So let's see, the April 1 memo was addressing, like Oliver mentioned, the two letters we got from the building industry and the city of Vancouver. Essentially, there are several issues raised regarding, we'll start with the market factor and how that's working. The recommendation from the committee was to keep the existing market factor of 10% on vacant land and 30% on underutilized at a minimum. They had discussed additional market factor, I think 15% or more. What we discussed within the committee was that in previous years, the council has used the market factor for boundary sizing. It's done on the demand side. So what our recommendation was to not include it in the model. And if the council wants to consider that when you get the new population projection, that's completely fine, but it should just be outside of the model. So that's how we address that. There were some issues with development in commercial areas in Vancouver and how that might be a self-fulfilling prophecy. What we were trying to do in coming up with recommendations is to actually recognize the growth that's occurring in downtown, recognizing the changes the city council has made to allow residential development in their commercial zones outside of downtown. The model currently doesn't account for any of that. So when you're looking at capacity, it's going to underestimate any growth that happens in those areas. And it's just trying to reflect what's already existing and happening the way the guidelines suggest that we do it. The infrastructure set aside was something that we spent a lot of time on within the advisory committee. We hired a consultant, AHBL, that was working with Eco Northwest on this. They ran numerous analysis looking at development countywide over certain time periods, looking at some of the issues related to increased needs for stormwater facilities. And we did find that that was the case. What we found later in the process is in comparing the methodology that the development industry had been using relative to what the county had done historically, there was a difference that needed to be reconciled. So once we had HBL do the analysis again, and the recommendations that were put forth by the project team are pretty close to what the building industry has suggested, and it requires some refinement to how we treat critical lands. And those were two items that the committee sort of ran out of time to make a recommendation on, but there was discussion about that in our last meeting. And I think they were recommending a 31.5% infrastructure deduction, which is pretty close to what the building industry had originally recommended in the information they submitted in 2015. So I think we've sort of adopted some of the, essentially their methodology and how we go about that. And it just required us to do some refinement within the model on how we treat critical lands. So the land for schools and parks, there was it's an issue that was brought up several times. We believe that it should be accounted for, but we think it's better to account for it again on the demand side because of some of the issues that were outlined. Essentially, the capital facilities plans that the schools and parks come up with will identify how that's calculated on a per capita basis. The other issue is that the alignment with school districts and urban growth area boundaries are not quite aligned. There are at least five school districts within the Vancouver UGA alone. So that creates additional problems in how to account for that on the supply side. And so our recommendation is that we look at that when we, again, update the comprehensive plan, and that be part of the demand side when we're sizing urban growth boundaries. Sort of ground truthing and verifying the model, we fully support. We've worked with CRDC looking at certain areas. Through that process, we've identified some things that shouldn't be in the model, some areas that are mitigation land banks that we show as having current capacity. Doesn't make sense to do that. So we encourage doing the ground truthing, and if there's things that are in the model that are wrong, we want to fix them. So we have, that's completely fine. Rural lands, the methodology to estimate the capacity was reviewed with the advisory committee. There were no recommended changes to be made. It's based on zoning capacity, so it's different than how we estimate capacity in the urban area. And so we will get that total, and that'll be in the report. Essentially, we're accounting for the growth that's occurred over the last 4 or 5 years, and then we're projecting the remaining capacity based on zoning. The city of Vancouver raised some issues about the VBLM undercounting population, and some of the issues related to that are really with the model showing growth on land that wasn't expected to develop. So for instance, all the development in the commercial areas in the city of Vancouver don't show up on the model. So if you're looking year over year comparison and seeing a decline in capacity in the model capacity, it won't show up there because the model never anticipated growth to happen there. There are changes in zoning and comp plan designation that also sort of mask some of that growth. There were a few areas where a lot of jurisdictions saw some growth in commercial areas that the model didn't anticipate. There are also areas where the model excludes lots that are less than 5,000 square feet. And so we'd seen a large increase in the amount of land that had been developed that were under those 5,000 square foot lots. And so that wouldn't show up as a change when you're looking year over year. So we shared that information with the city, and I addressed some of those issues. Which again, the recommendations that the project team is recommending and that the advisory committee has taken on tries to address the accuracy by accounting for those things that weren't in the model previously. The new residential development on vacant underutilized commercial land in Vancouver. Essentially, we looked at the growth that's happened in the last 4 or 5 year period, and took a slightly more conservative approach, not anticipating that that would continue on for the remaining 20 years, since that's a type of development that we haven't seen. It's sort of unprecedented, but we will continue to monitor that. If that continues to happen, we will make adjustments. But that was the project team's recommendation, and the advisory committee did look at that, and we had actually 2 different scenarios that we ran in the model, and so the committee could look and compare between the 2, and they chose one over the other. Again, the residential infrastructure deductions and the critical land deductions were the 2 outstanding issues. We did make an adjustment for those higher density multifamily zones where we would anticipate maybe less infrastructure, and the committee agreed to do that. When we looked at critical land deductions, we did look at countywide, and it's an average over all of the jurisdictions. The assumed housing densities are one issue where there was, well, we use a solitary number, the density number that our target density. So for the city of Vancouver, we assume there's 8 units an acre overall that's going to happen. But what we noticed is that it would make more sense to try to move our way towards zoning. There's some issues with the model with that, but at the least having a difference between urban low and urban high, because as we've seen with the city of Vancouver, at the urban high level, they're achieving 22 units an acre. At the urban low, it's closer to 6. So in some cases it overestimates, and others it underestimates, and it's just trying to get more accurate, and by having those 2 different density targets. And also within the city, especially in the downtown area and the commercial areas where the zoning density is much higher than anywhere in the city, and focusing that higher number just in those areas, because when you average those things, you're going to get a much, it's going to be more unrepresentative of what's actually occurring. So that's one thing that we suggested. I think there was, the committee at the end was made the recommendation to stay with the existing density targets and not reflect the achieved density. With the reporting that we have to do to the state, we have to reflect the achieved density. The question really is, do we want to base capacity based on that target or based on the achieved density? And it's really going to be an issue for the new how we address the development in the city of Vancouver. I don't know how that would make sense to assume development there at such a low rate. So that's something that I think is something that needs to be revisited. With regard to home and rural-based jobs, that's not something that's part of the model. If the council wants to assign or account for home-based jobs and jobs in the rural area, that would be something that would be addressed when we do the comprehensive plan update and sort of do the distribution of employment and population through that process is where we would address that. Do you have any questions?
Are there questions of the council?
Madam Chair,
Councilor,
just a quick question. Just for clarification, Jose, on the density targets, you'd mentioned density targets versus density achieved. So are the targets then lower than what's actually been achieved? Is that the issue? Could you just clarify that a little bit for me?
So it's really in the city of Vancouver. So the city of Vancouver UGA, the density target is 8 units an acre. Looking at all of the development that's happened within the city, both in the residential and non-residential land, they're achieving a density of about 17 units an acre. So they're doubling what we're planning for. So that
Okay, yeah, that
has
makes
some
sense.
impact on the model. Most of the other jurisdictions are pretty close to their density targets. There's the variance isn't as nearly as bad as, well, as in the city in terms of going way beyond.
So then if we chose to go with achieved densities, it would pretty much be a wash with the rest of the jurisdictions with regard to target versus density, or target versus achieved then?
Yeah, yes.
Councillor Olsen, this is Oliver. I wanted to just mention quickly that with the issue that the city of Vancouver have raised, I have reached out to them and they have reached out to me too, so that we are going to be talking offline to see how we address this issue of achieved density within the city proper. Because as Jose indicated, and this was a concern from some members of the advisory group, technically, if you look at what have occurred in the last 4 or 5 years, Jose was, I would say, conservative. If you look at the waterfront, they are really coming in like over 100 units to an acre. So would that continue? I don't know. Land is infinite. When the development along the waterfront is done, it's done. So we're going to be having additional dialogue with the staff from the city of Vancouver to see how we address this particular issue. I don't have an answer for the council at this point. Hopefully in my dialogue with the city, we may come up with some way of treating addressing the issue. One option could be, do the city want us to apply a different density within the downtown area or some areas? If that's the case, then you anticipate that whatever that density is going to be what we monitor when we look back 5 years from whenever the council adopts the new plan. That is one option. In terms of achieved density versus target, one of the recommendations that the project advisory group made was the cities, that is the smaller cities, to weigh in on that recommendation before the council adopts or directs us on what to do. So that option is also on the table. With that, I will stop.
thank you. Did that answer your question, Councilor Olsen? Okay. Any other questions at this point?
Madam Chair,
Councilor Brown?
there are a couple of motions that I would like to make. And I can either make them together because they're related or separately. as you wish, but I would ask that we project a memo that is from that coalition of the private development sector so that you can see what I'm referring to. This memo on page 3 is, I just dropped my glasses. That's not good. I've got another pair. This memo is signed by Eric Galimo, Jerry Olson, Ryan McKinster. I should say their associations. Ryan is the Building Industry Association. Jamie Housley is Jordan Ramus. Jerry Olson, Olson Engineering. Jihoon Han is Clark County Association of Realtors. Eric Galima is SGA Engineering, and Jennifer Baker is CREDC, Columbia River Economic Development Council. So
Councilor Bowerman,
yes,
may I just interrupt 1 second, just to
of course.
put in a little bit about the signatories. Jamie Housley is representing the Development Engineering Advisory Board, as is Eric Galima, also representing a Development Engineering Advisory Board. Jerry Olson is of Olson Engineering, is representing Responsible Growth. I think it's important to include the organizations that these individuals are representing, not just themselves, but they're signing on behalf of the organizations they represent. Okay, go ahead, Councilor Baum.
And I was also going to mention that they served as well on the with the group, the larger group that worked on putting the report together in the first place. So this letter was written as a summary, really in response to the Clark County Buildable Lands Report of February 2021 that was prepared by Eco Northwest. There are 6 points, and they are numbered in this letter, are included in the points that Jose just referred to as he made a review of a different position on these 6 points. So the second approach that I'm going to suggest deals with format. So I think I'll talk about that a little bit later. I would like to move that each point that is in this letter from the coalition of the private development sector be included and addressed in the buildable lands report. And note that I am not referring to a generalized summary of their memo, but to each of their 6 points individually.
That's a motion. You want this in?
That is a motion.
Okay. We have
And I'll be happy to discuss it if there is a second.
yeah.
Madam Chair, can I ask for clarification? So the motion is to include these 6 points in the formal report? Is that what the motion is?
That is correct. Many of these are already included, Counselor, but from a different perspective. They're included, but from a different, I'm going to use the word ideological view of the particular issue at hand. So if the issues in this letter were adopted, it would use the same data that is already produced, and in many cases lead to perhaps a different end result. As the building industry folks themselves said, they are concerned that a true inventory and market conditions may not be represented in the draft report. That draft report is, I've forgotten now, like 72 pages, and it does not happen to follow the RCW requirements of what is covered. Although those points are there, they're not in the order of the RCW. And so anyway, that they may not be represented in that draft report, and policy implications that we pull from that draft report on housing availability and affordability may therefore not be what we actually intend. So that's the perspective that they are taking in each of these 6 points.
So Madam Chair and Councilor Bowerman, if this will help inform us and focus once we get to hearing on especially these 6 areas, it's more information, not less. So I certainly would second that notion. As I'm assuming this is more a matter of procedure to get this into the record for us to focus on once we get to a hearing. So that's my understanding. With that understanding, I would second your motion.
Has he understood that correctly, Councilor Bowerman?
I'm not sure what you mean by procedure in this case.
Well, to make it part of the record so that we,
Yes.
once we get to
Yes.
hearing, we'll be focusing on these issues.
Okay,
Yes,
so this will be a part of the record regardless.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we need a stronger motion than this. It's a part of the record. I would suggest, or may I make a friendly amendment to that motion?
Let's see.
Here's my friendly amendment, that these points made by these prestigious groups who are on the ground in our county, that they be implemented as suggested in all 6 points for the buildable lands model, vacant buildable lands model. Does that meet with your approval, Councilor Bowerman?
I take that as a friendly amendment, totally consistent with the intended meaning.
And would that meet with your second, Councilor Medviji?
Yes, I'll second it.
Okay. Is there further discussion?
Madam Chair,
Councilor Lentz?
I have a question for staff. Jose or Oliver, is there data to support the 6 items that are in this letter?
I don't think that there are. One is, I don't think that there is any data to support the market factor issue, for example. What the group recommended was to retain the current 10% of our vacant land will not convert over the planning horizon, and our planning horizon is always 20, and that the 30% of our underutilized will not convert over the planning horizon. That we have sufficient data to support. Now, if the council, for the sizing of the urban growth boundary, decide to add additional market factor, that is a policy call the council will have to make. But there have to be findings to that. So there is support in the record, or data in the record, to support the 10% and the 30%. Now, additional market factor, that is a policy call. Now, on the infrastructure set aside, this is an area where we have had differences of opinion on what it should be. And that is why we had an independent contractor do this work for us, so that we will get away from what it should be. Let an independent body look at this. And that's what they have done. When you look at the report submitted by that independent professionals, including recognizing that the county adopted the new stormwater regulations and so forth, their own number came below the 27.7 that the county was using. However, we asked them also to take a look at the studies submitted by the building industry, which they did, and that's what Jose was alluding to. it is a difference of methodology. And we said, okay, we will recognize the way you do this, and even accounting for that, the conclusion was to move the 27.7 to 31.5. So there is some documentation to support that. So that's where that recommendation is, because it can be supported. On what to do with schools and parks, that's again is a decision that the council will have to make. Do you want to, on the demand side, do you want to have county staff and city staff in sizing of the UGB designate, or I don't know what the number should be, land for schools and for parks? Or do you want to rely on the 6-year capital facilities plan submitted by the school district and parks to identify their needs as part of the planning process? That's one option. Other issues, I don't have any evidence to support them.
Oliver, could I just interrupt 1 second just to ask you this question as a quick supplement to the request that Councilor Lentz just had, or the question. If these groups were able to produce actual data, that is what I am assuming. These folks have data because they work around on a daily basis to be able to substantiate requests. And if they were able to produce, I'm only suggesting that we do this if there's data to do this. This has to go to Department of Commerce. So there has to be data. I would ask for their help to provide the data to back all of this up. I am assuming they have the data. Otherwise, they would not have put it into a memo and requested that we do this.
Councillor, that may be one option. Remember that at the end of the day, you will be making a recommendation to your staff. In this case, Bob Poole, what are the factors that is going to be considered in running the model? That's what this is all about. So for example, if you take the infrastructure set aside, should we run the model based on 31.5%, or should it be run it on the old way of running it, 27.7 as an example? So that's one. Two, he's not going to run any model based on a market factor that the council have not made any. We are not sizing the urban growth boundary. This is to determine how much land we have now. So what should the market factor be? The recommendation is that we maintain the 10% of the vacant land won't convert and 30% of the underutilized. There is no data to say it should be something totally different. So the whole exercise is, what type of recommendation would the council be making to enable Bob to run the model going forward? That's really what this is all about. And if there are data to support some of these positions, we will welcome that. And as you say, this is already part of the record. And that is why in the case of the city of Vancouver, I am open to have a dialogue with them offline so that we can come to the council, hopefully during your hearing, so that they can present their position and see if we staff can support them. So that's really how this should proceed. If you go to a hearing, they're going to appear before you and present their findings or present any additional information. They did that, I recall, during the 2016 plan update, where they submitted data to support a much higher infrastructure set aside. What did we do? We reached out to the smaller cities and said, you let us know what you're seeing on the ground. And we also reached out to our stormwater division or Clean Water Division, I think it was Ron Warenge, who later left, and we said, run some report for us. We also went to community development. Let us look at actual development subdivision and see what the information is telling us. And we used that report to support the 27.7. That's why that number wasn't changed in 2016. Well, after 2016, the stormwater reg came into being. So now we are including that in this new way of looking at infrastructure set aside. So that to me will summarize how I think they should proceed.
Madam Chair,
Councilor Bowman.
if you could move down on page 1 of this memo, I'd appreciate it. Oliver, you were referring to the market factor, which is number 1 down here. The data exists. It's not that we don't have the data, it's how they're interpreted. So the market factor, they're saying, underestimates the amount of land that doesn't convert. And so if you look at the last sentence there, however, the model showed over 45,000 available capacity. And according to that data, there's a baseline that must be considered, which could be reflected in a change to the will not convert factors and assumptions. So it's not a lack of data, it's the assumptions that undergird this. And that's what we're calling for a change in. And they conclude, based on this, we feel the market factor recommendation is too low and underestimates the amount of land that doesn't convert in that 20-year cycle. So a more appropriate factor, they say in the last sentence of number 1 there, might even be closer to a combined 35 to 45%. But the point being that the data are there, it's how we use them and how we interpret them. The same thing with number 2. The data exist relative to this particular point on the residential demand in the city, but it is, they regard it as a trend, and we should maybe no longer make the assumption that is for the way that the residential land has played out at this particular point in time. And they point to the concern that if we do that, we might actually end up with a profile of excessive rentals in the area, which not only would increase density, but limit the type of housing variety that is available. And one of the goals, of course, is to make the housing availability types be a closer variety and match for what is needed in the area. So, and it's the same with all of these points. It's how the data are interpreted, not the lack of data. I think the consultants have presented a lot of data in that 72-page report, but how we look at it can differ.
Madam Chair. Sorry.
Councilor Olson.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify, maybe process a little bit here, and try to understand the motion as well. So is the motion that the numbers in this memo are the actual report, or that we're changing we're finalizing the report and including these numbers instead of the other numbers that was recommended by the project group? Then my other question is, I mean, I think all these points are valid and all this deliberation is critical to how we get to direction for staff. I'm just wondering if this isn't part of what we should or could be doing in the actual hearing, where we look at all the record where it's in front of us here and we decide that instead of a 10% market factor, we want it to be 15. I just want to clarify process, because all this conversation is important and critical to how we go forward. So I'm just trying to understand the motion and then maybe what process we should go through.
with regard, Madam Chair, with regard to the second point, delaying the discussion of like what we're having today would certainly be fine with me, but I think it presents a problem as far as the time, because there is a deadline for the report to be going to Department of Commerce and meeting that time in the event there are changes to the body of the report become increasingly difficult. So that's the reason for going ahead with it today. And as far as the numbers, it's the background numbers, the research numbers, what is the existing density, those kinds of things have been researched and reported by the consultants and probably by staff as well in the consultant's report. It's the way in which those numbers are interpreted with the assumptions that underlie them as far as how they are applied. And therefore, the numbers that might change would be the bottom line numbers that we mentioned at the outset that there's a concern about that would point to implications for housing availability and affordability.
Does that answer your question, Councilor Olson?
Not really.
Okay, well, I think actually the reason for this discussion now is to let staff know our concerns about the assumptions that are made by this advisory committee and what the concerns are of individuals in our community that actually do this work on the ground. And I think it's important that staff know this direction at this point in time, because we are moving forward. The timing is important on this. And it truly is the assumptions that are the issue, not necessarily the numbers. The numbers might be okay, but if you make certain assumptions wrongly, then it changes the outcome of this model and what we give to Bob Poole to put into the vacant buildable lands model.
Okay. Yeah, and I would if there's data, additional data to support what we have here in front of us, I would hope we get that. The one concern, I want to make sure we just got out of litigation, years and years of litigation through the Growth Management Hearings Board. And this model is subject to that same scrutiny. So I just want to make sure that the decisions that we make, and I understand and respect all of these folks as well, that we have the appropriate amount of foundation to the numbers we put in the model.
Madam Chair, I believe the best outlay of the data are in the Eco Northwest Buildable Lands report, that 72-page or however many pages it is, report that we received that was dated February 2021. And then also some of Deeb's memos from the engineering group on the infrastructure deduction provide some additional information. And those are appended, all of them, to this letter that we received that is before you now.
Madam Chair, may I make a few points?
Councilor Mandici.
Thank you. So I think all of this is very important for building the record to show either a growth board or a court that we are making an earnest effort to get the best information to base our policy decisions on once we get to them. And I want to thank both Jose and Oliver for the additional work and outreach now that you're doing with Vancouver. And I would suggest and support that should also occur with each of the growing cities, especially those that are growing very, very rapidly. I think these are good efforts to give us the best information to make our policy decisions. I want to share briefly what we had discussed in our one-on-ones, because what I was looking for was a non-adversarial, non-advocacy, basically use our staff expertise to look at these reports and different opinions, and then tee them up as policy decisions for us, each and every one. What are the pros and cons of adjusting different things? I see that you've already adjusted and reacted to some of the criticism. I mean, the reality of this process so far is that we had one major area that wasn't even voted on because they ran out of time. There were other major areas where there was no plural, no positive result. And so those areas where there is mixed opinion, that's what we need to focus on and tee up the data, supported pros and cons of each of our policy decisions as we try to make this building stone of our comprehensive plan as good as it can be. I would, we never really got to that point, at least from my point of view, where I saw on each and every single issue that was raised in these letters by both Vancouver and the building industry, where we had honest and virtuous effort to say, hey, here's the analysis, here's the pros and cons, here's your choice, here's what happens if you choose option A, option B, option C. Council, it's your decision to make it. Now, I know we have that coming up in our hearing. So I support what Karen Barrowman is attempting to do with this motion, because I also supported it in a different way in our one-on-one. I really wanted more of an honest effort to support the opinion or those opinions where there was no agreement, so we can make our policy decisions.
Madam Chair?
Councilor Lentz.
Yeah, I think like Councilor Olson, a lot of my interest and concern here is just making sure that we have something solid as we move forward, both to base future work on and to cover ourselves in the instance of, the possibility of future litigation. So I still seek a little clarity, I guess, on what this motion is doing. And Councilor Olson asked the question, and I'll ask it again. Are you seeking to replace numbers that are in the current report with the numbers that are in this 3-page letter? Because, and then my question, and I do want to answer that, but I'm going to keep going for a second. I'm looking at some of the notes from assorted meetings and at the report, and my question about does the data support this, I think is still relevant, regardless of the statement about how one interprets data. So, for example, with the market factor, the project group itself had this conversation. I'm looking at some of the notes from meeting 8, and this letter wants to increase, let's say that take it from 10% to an additional 15%. There was a conversation among the project group that said the data don't support that 15%. It does support the 10 and the 30, but it doesn't support the 15. And so I would then have a concern if we are going to supplant the 10 with 15, that we are heading into a place that may not be defensible. So that's why I'm seeking a little clarity on what specifically this motion is seeking to do.
Are you responding, Chair, or would you like me to?
Go ahead, you respond, please.
When you say, are the numbers going to be replaced, there are so many numbers in the report that is a kind of an amorphous thing to get a handle on. As far as the numbers that are in the analysis of what exists, we would make that closer to what is on the ground, which is one of the points that is here, with which Jose and Oliver have mentioned that they are inclined to agree. and would support doing that. But so some of those numbers that are research numbers about the status of our density, of our developments, of our available lands, all of that, some might change a little bit, but based on that factor of what is on the land, but probably not a lot. Where the numbers would change, as you referred to it, is in what is the bottom line after assumptions are made about those numbers, so that it is known how they're going to be interpreted, and then based on that, what conclusions are made. Those are the numbers that would differ.
I appreciate that. I guess I still don't have the clarity that I'd like
Okay.
before vote. No, please,
Okay.
please let me finish. I'm trying to understand the motion, Chair. So, and I don't feel that I have clarity about what exactly this motion what will the outcome of this motion be, and I don't understand that. And I'd like to before voting on it.
Well, if you read the fine tuning of this letter, in each of the 6 points, the final outcome would be different. It would be one thing for the first point and a different thing for the second point, and so on through. So with the first point, for instance, you say, what would the outcome be? Their appropriate factor that they're looking at might be closer to a combined 35 to 45%. So that would be an example of a changed outcome.
So then, pursuant to the question that I asked earlier, the goal of this motion is to replace numbers in the report with the numbers in this 3-page letter.
No, it's to replace the assumptions in
That are numbers.
No, it's to replace the assumptions that are made, that are perspectives of how data are to be interpreted, with the assumptions that are in this letter. And then, based on the difference in those assumptions, there would be a different outcome.
So
Yeah.
first may or may not be exactly what are in this memo, but using different assumptions. Is that what you're saying, Councilor?
Yeah,
Brown?
using the assumptions that are in this letter. And they
That are
appear
proposed.
in much of the debate that had gone on at the committee and in the deed memos and so on. They appear quite frequently throughout a lot of this documentation.
Madam Chair.
So my view on this is we're really just redirecting staff as we head to the hearing. We still have the hearing. And if the evidence and the data doesn't bear out, or we don't hit some other midpoint and qualifying some of these numbers as policy decisions, we still have the hearing. What we're doing is redirecting staff to follow this building industry letter, and it sounds like, the staff to some extent has already reacted in a positive way to Vancouver's letter and is looking positive at those density numbers.
Madam Chair.
Councilor.
I have a question for Oliver and Jose. So, because I'm still a little foggy on what the motion is going to do and what the actual impact, if it were to be approved, would have on staff. Do you have, Oliver or Jose, an idea of, if this motion passes, what it is that you're supposed to do going forward? Maybe you understand it better than I do.
Let's see.
I don't. So can I just need to ask a clarifying question on the market factor. The conclusion in point 1 is that a more appropriate market factor may be closer to a combined 35 to 45%. And they talked about that the market factor is unchanged at 10%. The 10% only applies to vacant land. They left out the 30% that applies to underutilized land. Am I to assume from that they're just combining and adding those two? So the 30% and the 15% on the demand side would be 45%?
So Jose, that would be a question that I think you could ask them, not us. We're asking you to try to implement the assumptions that are being made here in this memo.
Okay, so then the other
Ask
question,
us.
okay.
And similar to that, I mean, each one of these points can be picked at in terms of how many units are you talking about changing? And say, for instance, number 4, land for schools and parks may not be addressed in the model and could take away land available for development. They should be accounted for and can be accurately estimated because they both require capital facility plans. So, you know, exactly how many bits of land that is, how many acres, the office of the staff would be more likely to have those capital facilities plans than anybody. So what is the exact number that is going to be changed there? We don't have the answers to that. There is some debate about that, but that would be in the capital facilities plans. And the land for schools and parks is something that is clear and definable, and to call it as land available for development is what we're saying is not an appropriate assumption.
Jose, didn't you say parks and
Councillor,
already pulled out of it?
Councillors, if I may, Councillor Osini asked a question. I don't know, but if I may, the positions of the building industry is one that we have been trying to clarify. And what we can do is the report from Eco Northwest that you are citing is going to be an appendix. It's going to be a technical document, if I may. It's going to be an appendix to the actual report. The buildable lands report that will go to the state will only address 2 or 3 or 4 items. One is the densities that we are achieving, how that compares with the density target. 2, how much land is available within the urban growth boundary. That's 2. And you can then make do an exercise, which we can do. Some people call it planning by spreadsheet. That's not what it is. What you can then do, if we have 200 acres, we can all agree is vacant. If that were to develop at the achieved density, how many more folks would that accommodate? That's all you're reporting back to the state. And do you then have sufficient land to accommodate that growth that you plan for? That's the type of information that you're reporting back to the state. Now, for us to run the model, we have to be able to put in consider the recommendation of the PAC group and have the council direct staff to use those recommendations going forward. That's what the hearing should be, to consider the recommendation and the changes that have been made or recommended to the model. Should we use that going forward? Now, there are some of the questions that you ask in staff, and I've said this before. The planning staff does not, and we don't control the model. The person that manages and maintains the model is Bob Poole. And I know Bob Poole is listening in and he's on the line. He can chime in. What the council can do now is, okay, Bob, prior to our hearing, can you run the model based on this preliminary recommendation so we can see what that tells us? 2, can you run the model based on the old assumptions so we can compare the two before you make your recommendation one way or the other? So that is something the council can ask Bob to do. Bob, run the model the old way with all the old assumption, 27.7%, for example, on infrastructure set aside. Run the model now with 31.5%. Let's see what that happens. As I said earlier, there are some policy decisions that the council will have to make at your discretion. That is not what the model is about. You're going to be making policy decision. Do you want to apply another market factor when sizing the urban growth boundary? That's your policy call you have to make. That is not what is before you now. Secondly, when sizing the urban growth boundary going forward, do you want the county staff and the school district and the parks to consider adding more land for school and parks? That is in the future, not now. Because you already sized the urban growth boundary in 2016. You're not going to resize it until you expand it. So in the future, those are type of policy decisions you're going to make that is outside of the model. Now, this issue of available 45,000 available capacity, I can tell you from my own professional opinion, there is no available capacity or threshold that I know out there that says, okay, this is at the time that you expand the urban growth boundary. Because if you, as you are aware, we don't determine when we expand the urban growth boundary. It is on a cycle that the legislature sets, either on a 10-year cycle or on an 8-year cycle. They have moved that back to the 8-year cycle. Amendment to take it back to the 10-year cycle did not pass. So we are stuck on the 8-year cycle. So during the 8-year cycle, the first thing that the county does is, with the OFM providing you a range of population to plan for, you pick a number. And then we go work those numbers out with our city partners on who gets what. And as part of that, that's when you begin to make some policy decisions or policy recommendation as you size this urban growth boundary. Here are the things we want you to consider. They are outside of the model. And I think that, to me, summarizes what I would like to do. If you go to a hearing, I would say, ask Bob Poole, run the model, whether you agree with the recommendation so far or not. Bob, run the model, show us what this will look like. Run the model the old way, show us what this will look like, so that you can then see if there is significant difference. For example, if you recall, the group, I don't think, and Jose, correct me, the group looked at the recommendation from the assessor's office to say, about rear age and excess, and the group did not agree with that, and we run a preliminary number from Bob Poole, and we said, if you add excess acreage at the back of a property or on the front, it's about a total of 400 acres. That's the difference. Do you really want to care? Do the council wants to make that decision to add additional 400 or not? It's your call. It's not staff. Until you give us that permission, we will not include that recommendation coming the way that the assessors look at rear age and excess, depending on how you look at it. So those are some of I think there appear to be some challenge about what is the model all about and what it isn't. As I said earlier, the model does not usurp the county ability to make policy going forward. The model informs you on what data-driven changes you want to make. And that's all I want to summarize.
I just want to correct one thing that during this discussion on several occasions, Oliver, you have used the figure 31.5% under the point that's in the memo number 3B, and really the actual recommendation of the group that signed this, these 6 groups that signed it, is 33 to 35%, not 31.5. They're asking for it to be increased to 33 to 35. So if Bob Poole were to run those numbers, they would be using, if we were to ask him to run new numbers, it would be 33 to 35%, the 31.5%. So,
Councillor, that will be the councillor recommendation, not staff. They're saying
Right.
it should be, but just like Councillor Olsen was asking us earlier, is there any information to support this based on the work that the consultant and independent, a third party have looked at? I would say no, but if the council say use 32 or 35%, we will use that. But I think it will come down to what is the data to support that.
yeah, well, you couldn't use that to run a model to see what the outcome was and unutilized land. Anyway, actually, I don't want to belabor this any longer. I'm going to call for the question, for the motion. Hopefully you understand that what we're trying to do here is to insert into this whole discussion the assumptions being made by this group, in the memo, and by the advisory council as a whole, but the memo addressing assumptions. So I'm going to ask for the question. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
No.
Aye, nay.
Did I hear 3 noes?
You heard an aye from me, Madam Chair.
Okay, because I heard a gentleman's voice saying no. So the motion passed. Moving on to thank you all. Moving on to new business, the proclamation requests.
Madam Chair, I'm sorry, Madam Chair. So,
Councilor Olsen?
Is there a desire of the council to have Bob run some different models with some different numbers? Like, for instance, I'd be curious about what the model looks like given the recommendation of the consultant and the group, and then what it looks like given these new numbers that we're looking at. Some of them are ranges, so that'd be difficult. You'd have to pick a number in there, but I'd be curious to see what that looks like and what the impact of that
I
would be.
too would be.
And I want to throw in on that, Madam Chair, I didn't want to drag out any more discussion before that vote finally came. But so, where Oliver was saying those models weren't run, they should have been run. And then, of course, we knew it was run on the industrial backland and it made a negligible difference. I just assumed that all that work was done with the stakeholders and our consultant. Yeah, I want to see what it looks like and that the data supports it or doesn't support those numbers that we put into the model. So yeah, that work should have been done. I was surprised it wasn't, except in that one area of looking at it, the industrial.
Yes, I agree. I think that we as a council is a council in agreement that we should ask Bob Poole to run the numbers, the 2 different sets of numbers, and see what the outcome is.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So
Sorry to interrupt. I don't want to continue the conversation too. Bob will run the model. I don't think we are ready for a hearing. I think Bob will run that model, come back to you maybe in a council time, share the same information with you before we go to a hearing. That's my takeaway today.
yes.
I agree with that. I think that's dead on.
Yeah.
And Oliver, can you remind us what our timeline? I know we have a deadline here, and then we can.
Thank you, Councillor. What I have done is I've reached out to Commerce. Our deadline is based on the contract we have with Commerce. It's June 30th, 2021. They may give me some leeway if I can submit a preliminary report to the state outlining why there is a delay, which I could do and submit a final report to them in 2022. But any additional work we will do beyond June 30th, 2021 will be at a cost to the county and not the state. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Moving on to new business, proclamation requests, Older Americans Month and Dementia Friend. Have you seen the proclamations that were part of the packet? And are we okay to have those proclamations?
I support them both.
No objection by me.
Okay, with no objection, we will have those proclamations. The American Rescue Plan funds distribution. Oh my goodness.
Chair, I know Mark is on here, but if, I know time's going today. If you would like to delay this to next week's conversation, it's up to you guys. We can certainly delay it.
Without objection, we're going to delay this to next week. Hearing none, we'll delay it to next week. Councilor reports. And we got a text from Lindsay that she had an appointment she could not reschedule, but there is nothing that cannot wait until next week for policy decisions. And so we are going to go into executive session for pending litigation in accordance with RCW 4230-110-1I for 10 minutes with no action afterwards.
That's correct, Chair, and legal counsel will be present.
All right, thank you. So we're going to adjourn this council time and go into executive session, and that is a separate sign-in. So we'll leave this session. Thank you.